Welcome to another FSC Radio podcast. I'm Santiago, and along with Aedan, we're diving into how the concept of worldview, the way people and societies understand themselves and the world, has changed over time. From the late 18th century to today, ideas about how we interpret reality, morality, and society have been contested, reshaped, and debated across cultures and nations. How we see the world isn't fixed. It evolves, influenced by philosophy, politics, religion, and culture. You may remember from a previous episode with Dr. Garcia how the European encounter with the Americas challenged assumptions about human nature, challenging the concept that humans had innate ideas. Today we'll explore how such challenges have transformed the frameworks through which societies interpret the world. Welcome, Professor Todd Weir. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Very good. I made the journey north from the center a little bit late. Sorry for the delay.
No worries. Totally okay. So we brought you here, but we want to know a bit about you. Let the listeners get also to know who you are. So how did you get into this? What do you even do?
I am a professor in the history of Christianity and modern culture, and the emphasis is really on the modern culture because I came to the Groningen and to this field through history. So I was really working in history of science, history of politics, history of secular movements, and then I became increasingly interested in religion. So that's a bit my intellectual trajectory.
So you've started in history and then you moved into religion, but how did you land in here in Groningen?
Job advertisement. Nice. A friend of mine in England said he was approached by the search committee and he told them he wasn't interested in the job, but he said, "Why don't you ask Todd? He does this kind of thing," and that's indeed how I found out about it.
Very nice. So you're part of a bigger group here. What is it that
we have a faculty of religion, culture, and society. So we're now the last remaining independent faculty of religion and religious studies in the Netherlands.
Wow. Okay.
But we'll see how long that lasts because there are plans for restructuring of the university right now. So we're contending with that. But we have a big team of over 20 researchers working on all aspects of religion, history, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, etc. So it's a great place to work if you're interested in religion.
For people interested in this more religion side, what sort of bachelors are there? Are you in contact with this thing?
Yeah, I teach in two bachelor tracks. So we have religious studies, which is really kind of global look at history of religion, contemporary religion around the world. And then there's theology, and theology is more focused on Christianity, and many of the people that study theology have an interest in going into religious education or even into the ministry. So most of them are Dutch Reformed background.
Interesting. Is it English taught or Dutch taught?
It's English taught, yeah. We do, especially in theology, we have some courses that are taught both in English and in Dutch because the theology students often like to participate in Dutch. So we accommodate that, of course.
Nice. So I was now so we can land a bit closer to the podcast. Why is it relevant for people to study these things today? Why are we talking about history? Why are we talking about religion? Why are these things relevant to today? Those are things from the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, what is it that makes us self-conscious as human beings, right? Self-consciousness is not just about let's say, reflection on what you see in front of you. It's also about coming up with ideas about what you see in front of you. And one way of being able to represent reality is to put it in a time sequence. So if you can gain a bit of distance from your contemporary moment by stepping back in time to another era, you can actually gain perspective on the present as well. So this is I suppose this is what we try to offer to other scientists as historians, is we give them the ability to critically engage with the ideas that they have and say, hey, wait a minute, this idea itself has a history. It's not your creation, right? It came from somewhere. So let's look where it came from. And maybe in that way, the people who use those ideas now will be a bit more critical of them.
So it's maybe looking at underlying assumptions that we may have with ideas that...
Definitely. So the project on worldviews is a lot about questioning assumptions we might have about what is a worldview.
So you've mentioned now the word worldview, but if people are interested in this project of worldview that you mentioned, across the different projects that you do, they will find that it is not worldview that appears. It appears, but in parentheses, there is a German word. This German word is, sorry for the pronunciation, is Weltanschuung.
Weltanschauung. That's right. Very good. Nearly got it.
What is this? Why put the German word in there? What is this project specifically focused on?
Well, just like every idea has a history, they also have a history in language, right? So if you take the word religion, it will come from a Latin root, for example. And it's worth going back and looking at how people 300 years ago used the term religion, not in English, but in maybe a Latin language or in some other language. And in the same way, worldview, you could assume worldview just means how I see the world, right? Worldview. Right? But in fact, no, it comes from a whole philosophical tradition out of Germany, and it's developed for 100 years as the concept of Weltanchuung before people in English really start to use it. So if we want to do a proper history of it, let's go back to where it started, and it starts around 1790 with Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, because he uses it twice only, and continues through history and particularly in philosophy in Germany. And then eventually it becomes an international word that is now used all over the world.
So you've mentioned Kant. You've mentioned 1790 as the date of the start of the project. But for someone who might not be from our inner circle or so much from our culture, they may question themselves, why is it that this project is focused only on Europe? Why is it that we're not looking at the worldview from other places?
Well, we are looking at it from other places. In the project that I've designed and that I'm currently involved in, we look at it also from particularly North and South America. So we look at usage in English in North America, in the US and Canada, and in Latin America in Spanish as Cosmovisión. So we do look at it internationally, globally. It is a good question, though, right? Why is it that most of the history is European, and what does that do to the study of worldview? So I am a German historian. I work on Germany. So what I was interested in was how this German concept spread over the world. So ultimately, we are looking at the diffusion internationally, so that nowadays people use worldview to talk about Hindutva, the Indian nationalist ideology, or they use it to talk about Islam. Some scholars in Turkey talk about Islamic worldview, and they translate it into Turkish. So it is a global term now, but it does have European roots.
And then as well, maybe this is just me. If you had to give like a solid definition of Weltanchuung, how would you describe it?
This is a really good point, and this is like where the whole project gets a bit tricky, right? Because everybody has, if I say the word worldview to you, you could tell me your definition of worldview, right? You could say it's a perspective on the world. Or another person might say it's my spiritual connection to the universe, right? Or another person could say it's my culture, right? You could say all these things. Because we're historians, we're kind of taking a step back from the actual definition, and we're interested in how other people used it, right? So the whole point is not to have our own take on what is worldview. And that gets to this, I guess one of the points that we try to make is you mentioned in your introduction that someone last week said that there are no innate ideas.
Well, this is when we were talking with Professor Garcia, a philosophy professor, and when we were discussing about the challenging of the innate ideas that we come from Plato, that Plato said, we have innate ideas, but then when they discovered America and they had different innate ideas, it's like, maybe it's not as we thought. So this is where the innate ideas, maybe it's that we don't, not that we don't have, but like they were not as conceived as they were before. Okay,
so I mean, I suppose our perspective would be, if you look at social science today, look at the media, look at what journalists say, everyone's talking about worldview these days, right? It's everywhere in the news. I mean, people talk about Trump's worldview, for example, and so on. And people now, when they do talk about colonialism, they talk about multiple worldviews around the world. What we're trying to do is to question the assumption that there is something like an innate idea of worldview. So in other words, if I say everyone has a worldview, then what I'm going to study is I'm going to compare the different worldviews, right? That would be fine if that's the way I wanted to do my work, right? If I said, okay, here's my definition. My definition is it's the innate assumptions behind every culture, right? That's me as a social scientist defining worldview and now applying it to the world, okay? But if you look at the history of worldview, that's not the only definition of worldview. It's been used in many different ways throughout history. And what we're trying to do is to study its history. And also, we want to know about the power that's in the word, right? Because as soon as you hit that word worldview, you can suddenly do a lot with it. I'll give you an example. In Latin America, there was for, let's say, indigenous rights movements, there would have been a concept culture available 50 years ago. You could have talked about Nahuatl culture or Andean culture or Inca culture. So that's a nice word. You can do a lot with that word. But about 30 years ago, they ran into the concept of cosmovision, right? And cosmovision really grabbed people because it seemed bigger than culture. It seemed to go up towards the cosmos, right? It goes up to spiritual connection to nature. A deeper meaning, right? And then people have now used the term cosmovision to actually go to court and say, we have a cosmovision, we need to defend it. So it has a potency as a concept. And what we're arguing is that potency in the concept cosmovision, it's not just invented by indigenous groups in the Andes or something. It's actually invented over 2 centuries as this word moved across the planet. So that's a bit what we're trying to get at is like, what's the power in the word? Like, let's put aside the specific content and let's say, well, what power does the word have?
So then this really word, it started becoming, like, as you said, it started in the 1790, and then through there, it has suffered many changes. But I have a question here that I wanted to ask. Maybe it's a bit not so related, and then we can come back to this worldview topic. But this really triggers me deep down, and it's about history itself. And you being a historian, I thought this would be a nice moment to ask it. And it's that throughout history, it feels like, I have it here, put it as less things happen. When we look at history from the 18th century, sure, there were a lot of wars. There were the French Revolution. But if you look at the history of the 20th century, there's been, it feels like, or at least we're studying like it has, like many more things have happened. Is this really true? Or is this just a perception that we're just learning more about the recent history? Or is it the acceleration of the new days? What is true about all these things?
Great question. I mean, on one hand, I think you hit all the answers in the way you posed the question. So on one hand, if we don't know about the past, of course, it seems like nothing happened. Right. So if we went back in the past, of course, their lives are full and exciting and, things happen. So on the one hand, it's lack of knowledge, the way that we think the past is boring or that nothing happened. On the other hand, a lot of sociologists have said, well, what is modernity, right? What is the modern era since the French Revolution, since you brought up that connection? And some people have said, well, it's about the acceleration of, you also mentioned that word, it's about the acceleration of developments, or of happenings, or of processes. So there's a lot to be said for this notion of acceleration of processes. People look at different causes. Karl Marx would say it's capitalism, right? Capitalism drives destruction, innovation, consumption. I mean, all these things produce profit and differentiate groups, right? Marx said, I think, that capitalism will break down the Chinese walls. Like it knocks down the old order. So this is there. The acceleration also leads to a new consciousness of time. So in the past, if things didn't change so dramatically year by year, there's a notion that time is more cyclical. It's about the seasons and things return and, it's spring again. And then let's plant the plants on this day and so on. Whereas with this notion of acceleration, people can become aware of like, oh, hey, last year it was different than this year, right? And then that perspective changes people's perception of time and therefore history. You were mentioning the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is a moment in time we could choose and say, well, this is when people become conscious that something new has arrived, that this year is different than last year. And so ideas like progress, right, like history, they become possible with these major events like the French Revolution. So many historians, sociologists would say modernity is about this new consciousness of time as moving somewhere, right? It's not circular, it's progressive, it's directional. And modern concepts like worldview, they become connected to this idea of movement in time, to progress, for example. So if we wanted to talk about the history of worldview, we will find many examples where people said, my worldview is new. My worldview is pointing to the future. So that's part of the power when we talk about the power of worldview. Part of it is that it encapsulates, for some people, progress and locates themselves in a special set of ideas that seems to be leading to the future.
It is true that like every present leads to the future, right? But like, is it also that all these people that use the word worldview want to be like sort of like prophets of their time?
Some do, some don't, right? So what I look at in German history in particular is the late 19th century. So 150 years ago, you started to have these movements that were presenting themselves as almost on a battlefield, right? That they were a group with special ideas that were fighting for the soul of the nation. And one of the first groups would be the kind of people that said, we have a scientific worldview, and we need to marshal this scientific worldview against the old order. And it could be Christianity, for example. So that idea of like the conflict between science and religion, it's connected to the history of worldview, because the people who were very hardcore about science, they said they have a scientific worldview.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's really. You don't hear that. I don't know. It feels pretty new, and you're talking about it from the 19th century. Before we go on to the actual timeline of how things develop, we wanted to ask that a person's life is really shaped by their beliefs, by their philosophy, their culture, who they grew up with, what environment. But do you believe, or have you do you have a personal bias towards the fact that maybe some have more importance than others? Are some more relevant than others? Or all of them could play a different importance given different circumstances?
Great question. Again, I look historically at this question. So I don't think intrinsically any idea is better than another idea. I could say, yes, I do on another level, but let's say I don't think that the most powerful worldview is the best one, right? I do look at worldview from the perspective of group conflict. So you have emerging in modern politics groups, parties, religious groups that are fighting with one another for control of parliament or control of the public sphere or control of university life, whatever it is. And worldview has become a term that is used by these various groups to define themselves. So I don't think that one is necessarily any better than the other. I just think they're different. Why one succeeds is really worth looking at. I think it really varies. Why they're defeated, until recently, it didn't seem possible for fascism to come back as a worldview. But it was a powerful worldview in the 1930s. And then after that, it seemed completely discredited, right? So there's an example where a worldview seems ridiculous and out and extremist, and then could come back again.
Do you think as well the concept itself, or how it's been used, or by different groups that it's been used, has it become modernized in some way?
Yeah, I think it's a very modern term. So it's accompanied all of these transformations of the last 200 years. Its origin, 1790, so 1 year after the French Revolution, and it accompanies all of the changes. It has high points and low points. So in Germany, it was, let's say, the term used in the 1930s to talk about even politics, really. People didn't use the word ideology so much. They talked about worldviews. So at some points, it's been the most kind of modern term. And then it's fallen away. So in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people said, well, worldview, that sounds really Nazi. We don't like that word, right? It fell out of fashion, especially in Germany. But then in other places, it becomes popular. So in Latin America, it doesn't have that connotation. Cosmovisión sounds fine. So people have used it in the last 30 years. It's taken off in Latin America. And in, say, the United States, the idea of worldview has become popular in the last 50 years. And it keeps going up. If you go to Amazon Books and type in worldview, you'll get at least 1,000 books in English with that in the title.
That's
And
quite
interestingly, most of them are written by Christian evangelicals. So, Protestant Americans with very strong missionary views, let's say.
So now you've mentioned a few times 1790, 1 year after the French Revolution, as you said. I want to ask why is it this date that is chosen, but also a bit to give a bit of context, what was the world like before? You said before that it was a bit more cyclical, but is there something else you would like, something else to give a bit of context so we can have a better understanding of why this date is chosen?
Great question. So why particularly? Well, that's the first occurrence in German it's used by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. So we could say something about Immanuel Kant. Now, I'm not a philosopher, but I do work with a philosopher, Hugo Hohenberg, who was a PhD student, now a postdoc, and he knows a lot about, they call it idealist philosophy in Germany of that time period. And the basic insight, as I understand it, that Kant had was that there's the world out there, right? We produce knowledge about the world. It's not just about sort of reflection on knowledge. It's not just empirical observation, rather. Instead, the world is effectively constructed inside of our own minds. Like that's where the world is really created. It's in our minds. It's not outside. And as far as I know, what he meant by Weltanchuung was the tendency of the human mind to create a picture of the world. So the unity of the world is really something that we have a propensity for in our own minds. It doesn't presuppose that there is a unity to the world out there. It just means that we as humans like to think of things as a totality.
It's our way to simplify the world, or not necessarily simplify?
Yeah, it could be. I would guess it's like a tool of simplification, right? I think with Kant, he believed that the mind has these faculties, these processes that help make knowledge, and I couldn't produce them for you. But anyway, I think in Kant's philosophy, it's a lot about thinking through what are the processes that the mind goes through to produce knowledge. And one of them could even be this tendency to think about a totality, about a wholeness to the existence of everything outside. So we bring that possibly to the world. Now, I suppose Kant would also say there could be a totality out there, but we can't know it. But we do tend to see one.
Yeah, Kant was great, right? Kant was pretty influential. But before Kant, what were people thinking of the world? They must have think something, right? It's not like, oh, guys, Kant was like, guys, we got to think about the world. People thought about it before. Yeah,
sure. So in Germany, in German rather, Welt, world, is a philosophical idea as well. So you could talk about the world of heaven, the world of the earth. So there's a difference between earth and world, right? World, in a philosophical sense, is different from earth, right? Earth is this bit of rock, it flies around the sun. By world, we mean everything that is out there, for example. So that's so people, we're talking about the world before Kant. Kant just gave us a theory of Weltanchuung. So that was what was new. And then the philosophers after Kant, they took that idea of this tendency of the mind to make this totality, and they said, well, we could actually look at that historically, right? So we could talk about the ancient Hebrews and how they, with the idea of one God, created the possibility of thinking of the unity of the world. Because there's one God, there must be one world, right? And they could look at it. The philosophers after, like Hegel, would look at worldview as something that every civilization develops in history, right? So there'd be Greek worldview, Hebrew worldview, maybe Catholic worldview, and so on.
We've talked also about this in the philosophy podcast with Dr. Garcia. So if you want to look a bit more a bit the history before this superlunar that was discussed in that podcast, you can of course check it out. But now moving a bit forward in time from the 1790, we're not going that far. I wanted to ask, because this is really a personal question, but how I got in contact with you, Todd, as you know, was because of my fascination with a scientist called Alexander Von Humboldt. This polymath knew about everything, and I was reading this book. I finished it a few weeks ago, called The Invention of Nature, by Andrea Wolf. That if anyone wants to check it out, please give it a read. It is very entertaining. I did not know when I was starting to plan this podcast why was it that Alexander von Humboldt was not so known. But in the end, they explained sadly that it was because praising a German scientist during the 20th century was not really politically favorable. But for those who don't know Alexander von Humboldt, could you please explain who he is, why is he relevant in today's topic, and why should we know about this guy?
Yeah, so Alexander von Humboldt would have been a young guy when Kant came up with the idea of Weltanchuung. He was probably 20 years old, 21. He was part of that whole circle of intellectuals with like Goethe, Schiller, Hegel. Well, I don't know that he knew Hegel, but he was part of that German kind of romantic generation, also influenced by Kant and so on. And he and his brother, named Wilhelm von Humboldt, they're very learned, famous guys from around the year 1800. And Alexander von Humboldt was a naturalist, so his approach to science was to do a bit of everything. So that's why he was famous, because he studied everything. Mines, he started out in mines, mineralogy. He was in botany. He liked to work on the climate. He was very interested in volcanoes, worked on all these subjects. And he was also a kind of a traveling naturalist. So he was also a kind of an adventure hero. And he went to Latin America, and he climbed one of the highest peaks in the Andes. And then he was a good writer. So he wrote stories about it. He gave lectures. So he was, in the 1820s, one of the most famous men in Europe, probably. Lived in Paris, spoke perfect French, eventually made it back to Berlin, where he was from, and then gave a series of lectures called the Cosmos Lectures. And he tried to encapsulate the natural history of everything, right? So he was trying to do this impossible thing, which was to give a comprehensive view of science and nature. And that's maybe where the title comes from, because he was interested in the totality of nature. He said you couldn't grasp it if you just go after one thing, geology. No, you have to do botany. He even did anthropology, study of humans. Right. So when he's traveling around, he must have been absolutely crazy, right? I think he had notebooks, and he interviewed people about the native tribes of the Andes. He climbs up and he measures at 10,000 meters or whatever, 10,000 feet rather, for 4,000 or 5,000 meters. He's got his scientific instruments, and he's measuring pressure, and he's taking notes on everything. And then he makes these beautiful maps and diagrams later. So this is how he became famous. And I suppose the reason we also don't know about him is all the scientists who came after him said he was a huge inspiration, but he was wrong. In the sense that he wasn't mathematical. He didn't measure things properly. He tried to do everything, and no good scientist would do that anymore. So people admired him for trying to capture the whole thing, but they also said, meh, like, we can't use this material very well.
He didn't have such powerful theories as someone later on, like Charles Darwin, could have.
Exactly, but it's because his theories were also too big or too general. And this is, if I'm allowed to, this is where it gets to worldview. Yeah? So he said, going with this idea from Kant, right? So humans have a propensity to create a total picture of the world, right? And essentially, Humboldt said, yes, they have this propensity, but I believe that there is this totality out there in the world. And I think every civilization is trying to grasp the totality of nature. And he called it, that's one of his words, the Naturganze, the nature totality, the nature whole. So in a whole section of the Cosmos, a whole book of it. I mean, he's got, I think, 5 books. One is called The History of Worldviews. And what he does is he goes through the Egyptians and the Greeks and so on, and he describes their worldview. But what he really means there is their concept of nature as a whole. And it's this incredible theory because he's interested in their own picture. So how did they see the world? But he's also interested in the environment in which they created that picture. So he believed, for example, that you needed technologies to be able to create the picture. So technologies are part of the picture. So the telescope gives the eye an extension. So modern people, because they have telescopes, their world is bigger. Their worldview is bigger technologically. They can encompass more of the universe in their world picture because they can see it. And he believed that civilizations enlarged their world picture by invading other countries. So he talks about like turning points in worldview. Alexander's invasion of Persia would be a turning point because Alexander actually enlarged the Greek world. And in enlarging the Greek world, he enlarged their worldview so that they could, in a sense, see more of the world. So it's this very interesting theory about how worldviews grow. It's technology, it's ideas, it's science, and it's imperialism, or like conquering foreign territories.
But it sounds a bit counterintuitive that he sees nature and everything as unity, but then when it comes to humans, he sees them clashing with each other, one dominating over the other. How does he reach this conclusion? Like, isn't it like, are we not also part of nature, so we are also part of this unity?
Yeah, good point. So this is where that thing about modernity being about history and progress and direction. So he says, okay, look, every civilization has its own picture of the world, right? And so implicitly, worldviews mean they don't get it, right? It's partial, it's not right, it's and so on. But he did think that there was now the movement to what he called the general worldview. So what is the difference between, say, the Greek worldview and the general worldview of his day is that he thought that the general worldview was scientifically accurate. Right, so he starts to connect all of this ambition of the natural scientists of the 19th century and says, well, they finally caught that missing piece, which is accuracy, scientific accuracy. So he thought that the scientific method was going to lead the Europeans to a more or less proper understanding of the world. So their worldview was different from the previous worldviews. So in that sense, there was now going to be a kind of a global worldview.
Do you think that we're at a time today where one could argue that because we've reached this state of, I'd say quite advanced technological development, that we are at a general worldview in a consensus-wise way?
Interesting. Right. I mean, so people talk about the singularity of AI, right? That there could be a moment where AI comes to some kind of I mean, it's a fantasy a little bit, right? It's going to, as though AI, just because it's self-perpetuating, that it has some kind of consciousness that is better than ours or superior. I suppose people would say technology, even though it can become more and more encompassing, powerful, and global, media technologies, information technologies, and so on, they can also be constantly escaping control, right? So that we actually... No, we don't have a global worldview because if you look one day to the next, what the AI is up to is going to be different, right? So again, with the historical perspective, we'd have to say, no, every new incarnation of worldview is just another momentary development. That's how I would see it, right? And the idea that we could ever come to an end of history, I don't think makes any sense.
That's a good way of putting it.
It's a way like we've been hearing for thousands of years prophets about the end of the world that is coming. And I remember reading about Hegel. He also thought that when he became a professor in university, I think it was 1821, he was teaching his students that now the world is going to change. And because of his view, everything was going to be changing. And then the same with Alexander Von Humboldt. So then, yeah, I feel like we've heard this story many times, right? And then it's always with a new trend. But then I want to go a bit further because you also said that Alexander von Humboldt, he was not so liked by by the scientists that they said a great inspiration, but we gotta scrap all the work that you did because it's not so good. So who are these people? Are there groups now? Because as we'll probably see, science has moved from individual beings doing great things to more communities. But that could have happened. That could have started there or later on. So I'm wondering, do people after Alexander von Humboldt, were they also individuals in the same sense as Alexander, going on their own, or were they starting more forming communities?
Yeah, interesting question. So there was one of his, perhaps a student really, this guy named René Dubois-Reymond. He was German, even though he has a very French-sounding name, because he was a Huguenot, right? So the Huguenots left France in the 18th century, 17th century, and spread around Protestant Europe. So that was his background. And he was a physiologist, so he studied the human body. And he wrote about Humboldt afterwards, and he said Humboldt was like a great inspiration to us. He's a great man. We should have a statue to him, of course. Wonderful. But he also said he wasn't scientifically, he was the end of the road for that whole romantic approach to science. And Dubois-Reymond was precisely what you're talking about. He was one of the first generation of scientists at German universities who had these huge research budgets. All these research students, the scientific apparatus. So we're now in the Feringa building, right, which is full of scientists with big research budgets. So that's the beginning of that trend, is this guy Dubois-Reymond, so from the 1870s or so. And Dubois-Reymond also, not only did he say that Humboldt's science wasn't very good, he also had trouble with the idea of worldview. Because a lot of these people who were against the churches, they said, we have a scientific worldview, and they would point to Humboldt, right? And they'd say, look at Humboldt. Humboldt said we have a worldview, and it's a general worldview, and it's the correct one. So we're going to take that, and we're going to fight the churches with that, right? There's no God, there's no miracles and such things. And Dubois-Reymond said in 1872, he gave this talk to all the German doctors and scientists, this big annual conference, and he gave the keynote, and he told them, look, science has never been so powerful as today. But like any great conqueror, that's what he said, any great conqueror, there comes a point when you've conquered so much territory, such as natural science has conquered, that you have to stop and you have to say, what are the boundaries of my kingdom or my empire? And you have to put up like a wall around your empire, because if you just keep going, you're going to dissipate, And so effectively what he said is, okay, now science, natural science is really powerful, but we're only powerful if we live in our walls. Right? And what are the walls? And he says the walls are, there are certain things we can't answer. We can't answer the origin of life. We can't answer what happens after death. We can't answer ultimately the nature of energy, original movement. I mean, there are all these sort of things that he would talk about. And he was trying to say, what is good science? Okay. But if you notice those kind of topics, they start to get onto almost religious things, right? And that's kind of what Worldview is doing, right? Worldview wants to connect science to the ultimate questions, the totality, the meaning, where are we going, where do we come from, right? Worldview wants to answer those questions. So Humboldt said, Dubois-Reymond said, if you go there, that's bad science, right? And so he was telling people essentially, don't do worldview, right? Do science, but science stops. Science stops with just explaining what's on the table and what happens on the table. Right? It doesn't explain where we come from or where we're going.
So if I understood it correctly, maybe it feels like before the 1790, it was just religion, and that was the way we saw the world. And then Kant brought this new idea of a worldview that scientists like Humboldt brought into the table and said, guys, science is the way forward. And then he started expanding way too much to the point that this person, Reymond, had to say, guys, we need to put this an end. So then that was a bit of like the uprising of science, still the somewhat fall. What was people's reactions to this Reymond idea?
So I think mixed, right? Some of the people that are, even the scientists, some of the scientists said, no, we can answer all the questions with our science, right? And then other scientists said, no, you're right. It's better if we limit ourselves. And that's a kind of where people fell on that issue was sometimes political, right? So people that like if you were maybe a socialist or something, you might go for that big science worldview thing, right? Because it seems the idea that there's a totality out there, we can explain everything, that might correspond with some idea from Marx, maybe, about history being all about one thing, class struggle. People that didn't want to have a struggle between science and religion, they would like that argument, right? They would say, yeah, we need boundaries. We need to have, we need to make sure that religion and science don't mix, right? So it became a strategy that was common among a lot of liberals. So liberals, in a political sense, they often don't like extreme positions. Liberals see themselves kind of being ruling from the center, right? Not having extreme views. That's the way that anyway liberals like to see themselves. So that fit. Dubois-Reymond was a liberal politically. Like he wasn't a socialist and he wasn't a conservative. He was a liberal. So it gets connected to politics too.
What was the people in like for religious? What was the religious take on this? What would people because this happened in Germany, so I assume that probably, maybe I'm wrong, but in the south of Europe and the north of Europe there were different answers about this and different outcomes. How did this develop religion-wise?
Yeah, good question. So in the north, where this term worldview was circulating, so for instance in Dutch you have Wereldbeschouwing or Levensbeschouwing, and some Dutch theologians, they said, well, actually this whole worldview idea is not bad, right? Like because a lot of conservative Dutch Reformed thinkers, like there was a famous one named Abraham Kuyper, he said, well, actually, if I look at the world today, I think that I could describe the world as just a struggle between modernism and Christianity, right? And so for somebody who has that mindset, worldview is a great explanation. So for Kuyper, he's a Dutch politician as well, he said, christliche Wereldbeschouwing, right? Christian worldview, that's where we have to go as Christians. And so you start to develop this whole notion of Christian worldview, especially among conservative Christians. Because conservative Christians, often they felt very comfortable or they saw the world as a battle between two major forces, right? Christianity and what Kuyper called modernism. You could call it secularism or maybe atheism, right? So you have a kind of agreement between science extremists, let's say, the people that say scientific worldview and Christian worldview. So Christian conservatives and radical science visionaries, they kind of agreed. They said, well, it's a life and death struggle between scientific explanations and Christian explanations. So that worked for lots of people. Even today, it's a very powerful way of seeing the world.
What are the differences between North and South of Europe?
Well, interestingly, the term worldview didn't really catch on in the south of Europe. So you have you definitely have the same conflict, but in southern Europe, it would be more liberalism versus Catholicism, right? So, or in Spain, anarchists. So anarchists were the huge anti-Christian movement of Barcelona or something. And in, there was even violent bloodshed, I think, La Semana Trágica of 1909, where there's battles in Barcelona, priests being killed and churches burned and police firing on protesters. So this whole question about religion was very central in places like Spain, and the same in Italy. But for whatever reason, the term worldview didn't get translated. And partly it's a linguistic thing. So if you have visión del mundo or visione del mundo, getting my languages mixed up, but it doesn't have it doesn't catch the same way.
It's not one word. It's like
it's not
sort
one
of
word.
Phrase. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas cosmovision is one word. So that works. But it took a long time to invent that word, not till the 1920s.
So then we move out somewhat from the 19th century and we start to enter the 20th century where a lot of things happen, of course. But we start to see the, now conflicts are world wars, or as it was called in the time, I'm sure all of you know it, the Great War has this idea of like now there's a world war have an impact on people spreading the world view word? Or was it, well, you said 1920, 1930s in the Latin America, so probably it had some effect, this idea that now the whole world is involved into one conflict. Did the Great War have an effect on this worldview spread?
Maybe not so much directly in a sense. Why? Because the major parties in Europe were all monarchies of various sorts. I mean, not all of them, but okay, France wasn't maybe, but Germany, England, they're both monarchies, Austria, Turkey even. So worldview didn't really suit monarchy very well. So none of the nations fought as worldviews. They didn't have that term really. But what happened, I suppose, is that after the First World War, you had a lot more internal conflict in European countries and countries worldwide, right? So you enter into a phase of civil war, right, emerging out of World War I. With World War I, but out of it as well. So you have, even before the war, Mexico, has a huge struggle, has a revolution before the Russian Revolution, 1910. And one of the major issues is religion, right? And then you have the Russian Revolution. Again, religion is very important. And then you have Spain in 1931. You have a left-wing government, and religion is huge because the government is separating church and state. So in the 30s, there's the opening up of these major internal conflicts within all European states. And then worldview is very attractive, right? And worldview also does bring the religious in very well. And religion to Europeans has always been very important, but particularly in that period in politics, religion was crucial. So that talk of like worldview struggles made a lot of sense. And then you have, to get to the South American question, you have a lot of the Germans are the philosophers are obsessed with this problem of the collapse of agreement about truth and what is, and then this thing about worldviews and political struggle. So a lot of German philosophers start to develop philosophies of worldview in the 1920s. And then those discussions, famous philosophers, Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, they're all developing theories of worldview. Now, the people in Argentina, right, a lot of Europeans down there, they're also reading all these German philosophers. So they're interpreting what's going on in Germany in the Argentinian context. And that's where the term Cosmovision is developed. And so in other words, they're consciously reading about Weltanchuung, and they're saying, well, for us in Argentina, we also have we have questions or we have problems, and we're going to use Cosmovision. And, so Cosmovision initially is a lot about similar to what's going on in Europe, but in Argentina. So it's about the nation. The Nazis have this idea that a people, an organic, physical, biological people, should have a worldview, right? So the Nazis have a kind of racial idea of worldview. They think that any country can only be united if it's united in worldview, right? And Hitler said, well, Christianity is fine for uniting a nation as long as it stays united. But Hitler said the problem with Germany is that you had this guy called Martin Luther who showed up one day, right? And Luther divided Germany between Catholics and Protestants, and they never got over that problem. So even today, the Germans, but even in the 1920s, the Germans were divided between Catholics and Protestants, just like in the Netherlands. And the political conflicts had a lot to do with those differences between Catholics and Protestants.
They were like portraying like sort of like solutions to these tensions.
Well, but for Hitler, they were the cause of the tensions, right? Because he was an anti-Semite, so he thought that the atheists and the Jews and the communists were one camp, and that the Nazis and the Christians and the Catholics, the Protestants, and the nationalist right should be unified, but the Catholics and the Protestants wouldn't work together in one party. And so Hitler said, for that reason, we need a new worldview. Our worldview can't be Christianity anymore. It's got to be something else. And he said, how about National Socialism? Right? So he said that could be our worldview.
So I'm a bit curious. We've mentioned about worldviews in Europe, and we've mentioned Mexico and Argentina. But now after First World War, there is now as what was called before a regional power, now it becomes like somewhat as of a continental power maybe, is the U.S., who was a republic all along. How has the worldview developed in? Because now it sort of like becomes relevant to Europe too. What the worldview concept is in America. So how did they take this concept worldview? Has it changed? Did it change as they became more important, or was from the beginning not important and only became slightly important? How did it go? How did it develop?
Yeah, interesting. So I mentioned before that the most important innovators in worldview in America have been evangelical Christians. So they're sometimes called fundamentalists. I mean, some of them are called fundamentalist Christians, more conservative, more orthodox, missionizing Protestants. And so the Dutch minister Cowper, he was very well read in America, right? Because he's Reformed, conservative, and so on. So there is an interesting shift that goes on with these fundamentalists after World War II. And there's a guy named Carl Henry, and he is writing in 1947, and he's aware that America has become the most powerful country in the world. And he sees that the Americans are going to offer ideas to the world. And he wants the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, to be there, offering the world an idea. And so he sees it, he says it's a competition, and effectively his group can only win this competition for the world mind. He uses these funny words like the new world mind and so on. They can only win if they have a very powerful, unified worldview with a whole apparatus. They need new universities. They need a new press. They need all these things so they can expand in that period of American triumph, right? So that's an example of where the worldview concept comes up. Now, Americans aren't using it like Hitler. Like they're not saying there has to be a national worldview. You could find that kind of thinking. So in the 50s and 60s, Americans start to talk about civil religion, the idea that there's this Judeo-Christian basis for America's identity. So that's a bit like a worldview kind of thinking, but I don't think they use the term worldview for that.
When you were referring to this sort of like expanding, is this maybe the beginning of, in geopolitics it's called the beginning of the soft power? So like, correct me if I'm wrong again, but soft power is sort of like influencing other nations and other cultures, not by the means of force, by subtly through ideas, right?
Yeah.
So it's maybe sort of how when they started to conceive the world, when they could see that they could manipulate it to their benefit, and then this became greatly important after Second World War with the Cold War. So what happened in the Cold War that you said at the beginning that in the 50s, 60s, the concept of worldview, especially in America, became less important. But why is this? Do we know why?
So here's an interesting thing. After the war, people have looked at this kind of soft power element, right? Like you're talking about, like ideas, So how should the Americans after the war move into European intellectual life, right? And one way that they did it through the CIA backing was they created this group called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this was an association that was meant to be very attractive to European intellectuals, to universities and so on. So they had a bit of money. They paid for conferences. They paid for nice literary journals and such things.
A lot of scientists flying to America.
Scientists flying to America, American scientists traveling. They sent Jackson Pollock paintings around the world so everyone could see abstract expressionism. They sent jazz bands. This is like the soft power, right? But inside of that effort, there was this group that are sometimes called the New York intellectuals. And there were especially philosophers, sociologists, and so on. And they looked at European intellectual life and they said, the major problem, obviously they thought it was communism, right? It's Cold War. They want to fight communism. But they said the philosophical foundation of what makes communism attractive to, especially say, German intellectuals, but French, Dutch, whatever. What makes it attractive? And they said, well, it's this tendency towards total systems of thought, right? So some of them said very explicitly, what we need to do to Europe is to de-ideologize Europe, right? And philosophically, what this meant was we have to wean the Europeans from this tendency to think in systems and totalities. So philosophically, what they didn't like was the tendency of, especially German philosophers, let's say, to try to come up with a system of everything. And so even to this day, I think that the difference between so-called analytical philosophy and continental philosophy, this is partly about the tendency of continental philosophy, meaning German in particular. German philosophy is to try to come up with a system for everything. And the Americans said, no, let's just be pragmatic. Let's be really small scale. Let's not have a total system. Let's just be pluralistic. And let's just go with what works, right? Pragmatism. So they tried to export this to Europe as the ideology or the new idea of the Americans. And they specifically said that worldviews are bad in philosophy, right? And that what the Europeans had to do was to get away from worldview and to become pragmatists. And that takes us back to that 19th century argument over what is good science also. Because Dubois-Reymond said, you need boundaries. You can't explain everything in a system. Yeah? A tendency to want to explain everything in a system is basically almost religious, right? And so they would say European philosophy is still too religious.
Somewhat dogmatic.
Dogmatic. And, they have these big systems. So the soft power went along with the notion of worldview is bad, pluralism is good. So that's what Americans to this day, well, until recently anyway, would sell, right? Pluralism is good, dogmatism and system thinking is bad.
So Cold War ends. Maybe this is a bit of a spoiler for someone, but Cold War, we just talked about the idea that the people have in America, and then Cold War ends, and then all of a sudden there is only one global power, and there is nothing to combat it. It is the U.S. finds itself as the only power, the main power in the world. Does this have any effect on how they view the world, and do they start using the worldview here? It surely affects how they see others, but how does it affect this, like specifically?
So there's at the end of the Cold War, like one of the effects of the end of the Cold War is the term ideology doesn't seem to hold anymore, right? Ideology is mostly, people in the West use it to talk particularly about Marxism, right? People don't usually say my ideology is, especially liberals. They wouldn't say this is my ideology. Now, you could, of course, turn around and say they have an ideology. Everyone has one. But for whatever reason, at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 21st century, our century, there was the so-called return of religion, right? So suddenly, in the absence of political ideas seeming to be the central thing, many people said religious ideas or religious cultures are really driving politics. And there was that famous book called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. Huntington said, the world is dominated by these big civilizations that are battling it out through history. And he named 9, right? 9 of them. Western Europe, North America, Eastern Europe, Russia, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, etc. But when you look at it carefully, it's really because they're all different religions. Like what defines the different regions for Huntington. So it's really an argument about these religious conflicts. So it became very attractive to bring in worldview because worldview connected to that idea of beyond ideology, going back to religion, big civilizations. That's essentially why it became, I think, why we now are seeing a return to worldview as a kind of explanation for global politics. To go to your question about whether or not America per se was interested in worldview, I don't think that the dominant position of America in the 1990s and 2000s itself led to more use of the term worldview. There was an interesting quotation by Barack Obama. So when the Arab Spring happened in 2011, Obama gave a speech in which he used worldview in these different contradictory ways. So he said that he welcomed the Arab Spring in Egypt, but he said we welcome that that's compatible. Let me see if I get this right. But essentially, that's compatible with us, the dissent. And he said, well, but of course, it's going to produce lots of things we don't like, right? Anti-Americanism. I mean, Arab Spring is about this burst of free expression, right? And free political activity and Islamists and all this kind of stuff. But he said he wanted to draw, again, a boundary. And he said, we're all for the Arab Spring, but we're against Al-Qaeda. So he wanted to separate what he saw as the pluralism of the Arab Spring from the exclusive dogmatic attitude of Al-Qaeda. And he said Al-Qaeda was a foreign worldview, right? Whereas the Arab Spring could be, we can get along with that. So he talked about, in a way, a kind of inclusive worldview, which he thought that America had, which was a pluralistic and open worldview, open society, and then Al-Qaeda, which is closed, dogmatic. And he used the term worldview to separate these two things. People nowadays use it all the time, but it has a history. That's the point.
That reminds me again somewhat of the distinctions that were made between proponents of the sort of religious worldview and the boundaries, and then the boundaries between different fields within science and where the kind of edges of natural science would be. For some reason, that stuck out to me as somewhat similar to how nowadays there's this ongoing discussion of interdisciplinarity. And maybe I'm just biased because my faculty is very interdisciplinary. But do you think in any way there's somewhat of a connection between this, like ongoing developments in worldviews and kind of researchers collaborating more, and maybe also with kind of the lack now of these polymaths, and now people kind of have to focus on one or two topics by design, but then if you collaborate more, you still have that kind of development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think it's a good point. There's maybe a challenge to this disciplinary, boundaries, right? So maybe interdisciplinarity is encouraging a kind of unbounding, right? Like to break down walls between disciplines and encourage kind of more broad thinking and such things. And it could be that a term like worldview would become very popular for interdisciplinary work because it's big, it's vague, yeah? It crosses boundaries. You can talk about religion with it. You can talk about politics with it. You can talk about science with it. You can talk about philosophy with it, all these things. So you could be right. It could be that that's an environment in which worldview seems to be attractive to scientists. But I guess the point would be it's part of the reason why something could be attractive is because it's very fuzzy, right? And you can do a lot with it. But then you're building uncertainty into it because it's such a fuzzy term. It has power. It's developed power over 2 centuries, but scientists might not be aware of all the baggage it has.
Would you therefore recommend against depending on it as not necessarily a stable thing, but as a key term within research without the consideration of that kind of vagueness?
So, we can't choose our terms, right? They're given to us by history, right, where we are, right? I mean, all of our terms, religion, the secular, the terms that we use in my faculty, religion, the secular, those have the same types of complicated histories. I had this interesting debate with a colleague, Lois Lee, who's a sociologist of religion or a religious studies scholar in the UK. And we were debating whether or not this is a good term, worldview, for talking about religion, studying anything. And she said, and I thought this was very interesting, she said, well, I've been working on my own vocabulary because she works on the history of the secular, or not the history even, just secular people. What is secularism? What does it mean to be, what's the relationship to religion that one has if you're not a believer, right? So that's her research area. So she needed a term. She can't use religion, right? Because it doesn't suit. If you're an atheist, you might reject the term religion. And yet, you're interested in ultimate meanings and where are we going and where we come from. So she had come up with her own framework. And I think she used terms like existential stance, maybe. Like, what's your existential stance? So she had been busy working scientifically, like being precise about her analytical concepts. But then other people are using worldview. And in the end, she said, I just have to go with worldview because that's where the people are. Like that's where the discourse is. That's what people are talking about.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at like her work, I think she's going to do both. She's going to work on her specific vocabulary, existential stances maybe, and then also use worldview, because if you want to talk to other scholars, you have to use the term that's available.
Yeah.
So I think that's a bit what's going on.
That makes sense.
What's the current stance of on the term worldview? Is it used in academia? Is it used in very specific parts of academia? Is it used by general people?
Yes. No, it's used obviously by general people. As I said, if you listen now, all of your listeners, the hundreds of them out there, if you pay attention, just pay attention to any English language media, and you're going to hear it constantly. Worldview. Pay attention, because it's in this current recent incarnation, it's about 40 years old, right? It has an old history, but the fact that everyone's using it constantly has to do with the end of the Cold War, various things. So it is out there. And in academia, it's being increasingly used by many people precisely because people want to look at religious things and secular things in the same frame. That's happening. Then people want to talk about religion and politics together. So they're going to use it, right? And the more that people in the media use it to talk about Trump's worldview or this or that, and especially as we enter a period of polarization and extremism, it's a good term for talking about polarization, extremism. So it's out there. So scientists are naturally going to follow it and use it. Many of my colleagues in religious studies now use it, and I'm actually going to change my tune a little bit in the next project, which is I want to move from the historical examples where I say I don't have a theory. I want to now go back to those historical examples and try to say, what do they have in common? Right? This one, and to try to come up with a model of modern institutionalized worldviews. So I'm just going to look at the big ones. I'm not going to look at I mean, you can use it for anything, right? Everything can be a worldview. But I just want to look at the big ones that in history have made a big mark, and called themselves a worldview. And then the idea is to take them, try to see, okay, could I have a model of worldview I could apply to other things that don't call themselves a worldview? So, example, liberalism usually rejects the term worldview, but could I analyze liberalism from the point of view of these other worldviews? I could do the same with something like Russian world concept and Putin's Russian world concept. I could do it in Hindutva or something, or maybe the Chinese, whatever their current state ideology is. One could look at that as a worldview, perhaps. Wow. So that's a bit where I want to go. So I'm going to actually change my tune a little bit. I want to actually have an actual theory of worldview, which is a bit against everything I've said to you so far.
But that sounds very exciting.
It sounds pretty ambitious too.
We'll see. Yeah.
Stay tuned. I also wanted to ask you, do you have a personal worldview? I know you really try to, as an academic, you really try to not put any bias in your work. But how do you, when you hear worldview, what do you think of?
That is a great question. I think people often ask that. I did a TED talk some years ago about worldview, and then there was comments afterwards in the TED talk, and some people would write, Professor Weir appears to think he doesn't have a worldview, right? So, and of course, if I just take a definition like, your ultimate system of thought, and especially touching on the big existential questions, well, I don't need to reveal everything I think here in a podcast, but I suppose if you go to the level of like the big worldviews that have existed in history and the big arguments and so on, probably I tend more towards the liberal perspective in the sense that I'm skeptical about worldviews. So that's my worldview, right? I don't assume that there's this big unity to everything out there and that I can understand it. So I tend to think humans are limited in their knowledge and they're historically, it's all historically contingent. So I would tend to think that my understanding of the totality of the universe is limited. My preferences would be more liberal in the sense of skeptical, critical. Probably I'm, some people, German philosophers like Heidegger, they differentiated between world picture and world view. And they use the term world picture, Weltbild, to talk about the kind of background assumptions you have. So in German, worldview means what's up front. Yeah, like what do you believe, right? But then in the background, there's like common assumptions we have. So Heidegger said we live in the scientific world picture, right? So for Heidegger, everything since Newton is science, right? We tend to see the world as thing, right? We don't tend to see it as full of energy, living forces. We tend to see it as an object. And because that's how science sees objects, right? They try to dissect them, take them apart, and so on. So according to Heidegger, that we can't escape that. That's the world picture we live in. So probably there's something to that, right? And this is where getting to that thing about one of your first questions, I guess, about the European bias, right? You could make an argument that that the scientific world picture has something to do with European history, right? And that there could be other ways of being in the world that are different. Like that's the argument for some of the people talking about cosmovision today. They're not talking about Argentinian philosophy in the 1920s. They're talking about indigenous realities. And the argument for those people in Latin America would be indigenous people experience reality differently because they have a different world picture. They just assume different things about all of the stuff that we see out there. And it doesn't even have to be conscious necessarily. Just like I'm not conscious of the fact that I think of everything I see as an object, but that's the way I see everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. For me, at least, that idea of kind of this modern perspective or world picture as being very, item focused. And for me, at least, that kind of relates to the discussion we had earlier about this sort of cyclical time of, every year was kind of the main perception of time. And now it's more annual focused instead of seasonal focused. Do you think that maybe there's a message there somewhere for like people who are worried that this is just going to keep going and going and going and there's no way to kind of find not a peaceful worldview, but a more kind of stable worldview maybe in that sense? Would you have anything to say on that?
Sure. I mean, this isn't my perspective, but I just see this out there. So climate activists, for example, so they're worried about the catastrophe of the looking in the future, right? They're modern climate catastrophists. So they look in the future and it looks bleak. So that's modern. I mean, it's not progressive, but anyway, history's going somewhere. It's not good. And a lot of them will now say the only solution is a shift in worldview or world picture. And they will say that we have to look to indigenous worldviews to overcome the climate crisis, right? And that's very attractive to people globally. But it's still wrapped up in all of this kind of worldview talk, right? And yeah, it's an interesting question because people assume, let's say Westerners in this kind of climate, movement, they're assuming things about indigenous worldviews without actually knowing anything about them, right? It's just because somebody said to them, indigenous people don't see the world, they are the world, or some things like that. Or so there's these kind of statements that come up. So it's very difficult to know, like, what is the actual content of a cosmovision of the Andean people. People can do a lot of imagining on very little knowledge. So that's a bit like my dilemma about the use of the idea of cosmovision to solve the climate crisis. It seems like a good idea to have a different relationship to animals and living beings and rocks and so on. That sounds right. But to what extent do indigenous groups have the solution? And to what extent can they transmit it or communicate it? Those are open questions, I think.
Very much so. I think those are discussions that I've heard among many, many different fields at this point, but very, very interesting things. Anything else before we wrap up?
I think that's a nice way to end it, to keep the listener thinking about it.
Definitely.
What's your own worldview, listener?
Let us know. And thank you very, very much for joining us today. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was
amazing. Thank you.
It was
very
a
much.
fun conversation. Thank you so much
Incredibly
for having
interesting.
me. And good questions.
Thank you very much.
Glad.
I wish you all a beautiful day and see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.